I like that. Hey, welcome to Still Kicking with Billy Hauer. It is May 2nd, 2017. Thank you for looking us up, and I hope you find today's show edifying. As always, we will resist global fascism or the corporatization of politics and have a taboo peek at the serious downsides of science and technology. Our top stories today: the Wall Street Journal buries a report on U.S. airstrike civilian deaths. Also, the Wall Street Journal did a terrible job of reporting that Pittsburg has lead water. They have lead in their water. And altogether, 7 cities with over 100,000 people do have it. But the Wall Street Journal isn't reporting which ones. They only mention 3 out of the 7. And that's corporate journalism at its worst. And the Wall Street Journal wonders why they're losing subscribers and why they've had to reduce the size of their paper. Anyway, Iran is following Obama's lead in silencing their critics. And in today's fascist spotlight, greed is always evil. France loses Whirlpool factory for cheaper labor in Poland. The EU takes sides in the French election. And extreme fascism in Uganda and around the world. And Trump makes nationalism great again. Those stories are coming up. And on the Luddite Lounge, can the new movie The Circle expose the freedom-destroying data pigs in Silicon Valley? We shall see. Pete is wincing. He doesn't like it when I talk that way. Anyway, but first, I want to tell you that this weekend I was at the Cherokee Triangle Art Fair, where Pete was working diligently because he is part of the Cherokee Triangle Neighborhood Association. Is that right? Anyway, and as I was, browsing around, a viewer of Still Kicking, whose name I will not say to protect him or her, came up to me at the fair and said, "Billy, I watch your show and I've seen a few of them and I really like it." And he called me something that I've never been called, and a phrase that you rarely hear anymore. But it started out, he said, "Do you know what you are?" And I said, "Well, my friends think I'm a conservative now." And he said, "No, Billy." He said, "I'm a conservative and you're no conservative," which was kind of good to hear. And he said, "But you know what you are?" And I said, "No, what am I?" And he said, "You're a free thinker." Free thinker? Well, and I thought about that. And it's true, I'm really not a liberal. Republican, Democrat or liberal. I've been voting for Nader, as I've told you before in earlier shows. But, I go with the facts as I see them, and if the information changes, I change my opinion if I learn something new. So whatever seems true is what I go for. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or if you're a Democrat or if you're a globalist or a nationalist, which we're going to talk about a little bit later too. So I was glad to hear that. I was glad to hear that somebody out there in the audience thinks I'm a free thinker rather than a traitor to the liberal cause. But it made me think, if I can't think freely, then you can keep your politically correct revolution. And of course, political correctness is all about suppressing free thinking. Anyway, so here we are. I want to show you this story. I don't do this very often, but here's the story. Look at the headline. Wait a minute. Can you see the headline? It's awfully small. Let me put it closer. Can you read that? There it is. Airstrikes targeting ISIS have killed 45 civilians. So there it was. It was buried on page 3 of the second section of the Wall Street Journal. And this is typical of the propagandists who pass themselves off as journalists, these corporate propagandists. And this is true of the New York Times. They all do this. They bury these important stories. Well, what this little thing says is for the month of March, U.S. airstrikes targeting ISIS killed 45 civilians, mostly in Mosul. They did not include, this article says that that figure does not include the over 100 civilian deaths coming from the March 17th coalition airstrike in Mosul that we've pretty much admitted to, but not really entirely. So it looks like at least 145 civilians were killed just in the month of March. And this is very rare. They usually won't even do this. But this is how, the Wall Street Journal can say, well, we reported it. Here it is. Here's proof. They did report it. Well, what I often wonder is why there is no story on why ISIL or ISIS was able to take Mosul in a couple of days. And why is it taking us, what has it been now, 6 months, a year? I can't even keep track. Is it because ISIS is popular there? Is it because Mosul is mostly a Sunni city and they were sick of the Shia rulers in Baghdad? Is it because ISIS went into Mosul on the ground? They didn't bomb them. Bombing people doesn't make people love you very much. Is it because we're bombing them? How can you win a war just from bombing? When are the troops going to come in? No American troops. They're only used for targeting our special forces. And the Iraqi troops evidently ain't all that interested in going in and fighting door to door in Mosul. So you're never going to see that story in the U.S. press, whether it's the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, because propagandists don't do that. That would be journalism. So don't expect that. I guess that's enough about that. I have some other thoughts, but let's move on. Also in our top stories, water is life. The Wall Street Journal reported, I think it was today, that Pittsburg exceeds the federal limits on lead in the water. And the federal limit is 15 parts per billion. And in Pittsburgh last July, they measured 22 parts per billion. And in December, later on, 18 parts per billion. So they somehow got it down a little bit, but still over was considered a safe level of lead. Of course, there is no safe level of lead. Lead is bad at any level. And the article reports that 7 cities, major cities, exceed the federal limit. And they also mention Portland, Oregon, and Providence, Rhode Island. But the majority of the cities, the other 4, they did not mention. Now you got to wonder, because they don't want to create a countrywide panic. They don't want every city testing their water. I don't know. But these water systems are old. And if you ask me, is it Louisville, where we are? It's an old city with an old system. And I'm just wondering why they didn't do that. I mean, there was plenty of room in this article to mention all 7 cities, but they didn't. It's very curious, and the Wall Street Journal wonders why they had to lay off so many people. Well, there you have it, corporate journalism at its worst. Now, this is an interesting story you may have heard. A TV mogul was shot and killed in Istanbul. This was a rich man. His name was Saeed Kirimian. Sounds like he's Armenian, but evidently he is an Iranian citizen. He founded this company, a media company called Jim Group in London, and he based it later in Dubai and Turkey. Turkey has a smaller office. And they broadcast, evidently, the article wasn't that clear as corporate journalism goes, but the Kurdish, they broadcast Kurdish soap operas dubbed in Farsi. Now, soap opera is something the Islamic regime would not like. They also do an American show, which was unmentioned, of course, in corporate journalism. And he was tried in absentia for spreading propaganda against the state and violated the state's national security. And you know what it made me think of? I mean, Iran called this a targeted killing. Well, who else uses that term? Barack Obama. He's Mr. Targeted Killer. He does lots of targeted killings. And it reminded me of a particular targeted killing, one of an American citizen named Anwar Awlaki. You may remember him. He was a cleric in the United States. He was a U.S. citizen. He has children that were born here in America, in Colorado, I believe. And he was originally hired by the FBI and the CIA and other federal agencies to come and speak about Islam and educate their staff and their executives about Islam and what it all meant. He was a very loyal American. But then he saw how his community was being surveilled and treated and harassed by the said agencies that we just mentioned. And he was very, and he tried to protest, but of course he got nowhere because this is America, and unless you're an elite, you're not going to be heard. And eventually he went off to Yemen and he became a writer for, I think that the name of the magazine is Inspire. It's the Al-Qaeda magazine, or maybe I'm getting it mixed up with Islamic State, which came out of Al-Qaeda. But anyway, he was a propaganda guy, and he had a website, I think, and he had a magazine. So he was mostly a print journalist. That's how it's different from this TV mogul in Turkey. And another difference was that he never got a trial, not even in absentia. Oh, look, here comes my significant other. Here he is, Chapin Hartley. Look at him. Ooh, he hates to be manipulated. There he is. But he doesn't know. He doesn't understand the whole computer thing, but he does like to get on whatever I'm reading. Because he's very passive-aggressive. Whenever he wants attention, he does something that he knows will irritate me. Anyway, the difference is that, Anwar al-Awlaki was only in print journalism or if you don't want to call it journalism, and he also was not tried in absentia. Anwar al-Awlaki got no due process whatsoever. He got not a hearing, no secret hearings, nothing. And not only did Obama murder him, this U.S. citizen, with no trial, with no hearing, with no due process, he also murdered his 16-year-old son, who was not doing anything for Al-Qaeda. He was just being a 16-year-old, So, and of course, the Obama administration said that was a mistake. But it's always easy to say that when you bomb, say, a hospital, or something like that. But he got no due process. And, of course, with the Obama administration, the Constitution was always just optional. But that's how it goes in America these days. And, the thing about Anwar al-Awlaki, too, is that he was not wearing the uniform of another country, and he was not an armed combatant against us. And yet, he was summarily executed. And it bothers me, and it will bother me until the day I die. And you know that I am no fan of Islam. There isn't an Islamic country that is free. Not even close. People say, well, Indonesia. Well, Indonesia is run by murderous thugs who never went to jail. In Indonesia, Goodyear rubber used slave labor. And that's fascism at its best, too, or at its worst, in my opinion. Anyway, it's time for the fascist spotlight. And the extreme global fascist leader of the EU, Mr. Juncker, evidently called the French candidate Macron, the candidate in the French election, which I think is Friday, and he wished him luck and said congratulations on winning the first round. And that's great that taking sides in this. And in a related story, they both, Macron and Marie Le Pen, showed up at a Whirlpool plant that is closing in France and moving to Poland, where wages are a fraction of French wages. And that's called labor arbitrage. And that is what globalization is all about. This is what Paul Krugman and Robert Reich and all these people knew was going to happen and wanted to happen. They wanted to see the destruction of our middle class. And this is not only destroying our middle class, it's destroying France's middle class. And especially for people with just a high school education. And I will tell you, I will never buy Whirlpool again. I will wash my clothes in the bathtub before I will buy a Whirlpool washer and dryer. And the elites don't understand why Le Pen is so popular. And speaking of Le Pen, she's evidently, they say, behind in the polls by 20%. But if you were a French person just like an American, would you tell a pollster that you liked Le Pen? Just like the Americans obviously didn't tell the pollsters that they liked Trump because they didn't want to be called a racist. And when NPR, National Propaganda Radio, talks about the French election, they always describe Le Pen as the far-right candidate. And they do it religiously, and they never fail to call her the far right. They didn't even call Trump the far right candidate. Of course, they didn't know what Trump was. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. So the elites wonder why Le Pen is so popular. And I'll tell you, I think that she could win. I really do. Because I was listening to national propaganda radio today, and they had recordings of her speaking. I guess it was today or yesterday. And the crowds, they said, were huge. Just like Trump's rallies were before the election. They were huge. And they were enthusiastic. I mean, they were just cheering. It was deafening. So I would not discount her. And also, you know, the two major parties that did not win the first round have both endorsed Macron. And could be a death sentence for him, because obviously people are sick of the establishment, so they don't care what the establishment wants. Well, let's move on. Greed is always evil. Gordon Gekko in Wall Street was not correct, and a lot of Americans think it is. Adam Smith, or whatever that economist from the 18th century, thought that greed was good and aggregate greed created wealth. Well, you know, it may be good to a certain level, but any good thing, you know, to an extreme becomes a bad thing. And in this case, it's evil, especially in Uganda. A Ugandan citizen named Cynthia Misanya found the dismembered body of her 10-year-old daughter in a pit under an outhouse. Her daughter Jane was abducted, strangled, and dismembered. The body parts were recovered miles away. And somebody was arrested, and it was a businessman named Gilbert Odima, a wealthy businessman and a neighbor of Jane and Cynthia's. And the reason he did all this is because it's a satanic ritual. They called it a witch doctor ritual, but it's satanic. Make no mistake about it when these things happen. And it was designed to bring this businessman, Gilbert Odima, good fortune. It was supposed to make him rich. And they have dozens or more of these cases every year. And thousands go missing every year in Uganda. And child body parts are prized for these kind of rituals that are supposed to bring wealth or cure diseases. And not only are child body parts, they also do adult human sacrifices, but most of them are children, easier to catch, I guess, and they're more prized. And the body part most prized is the genitalia, sexual organs, if you don't know what that is. Uganda passed a death penalty in 2009, and it is rarely imposed. The trials usually last up to 5 years, and witnesses move away, and they get light sentences. And it shows the cultural acceptance of this kind of practice in Uganda. And of course, we trade with people like this now. All of this was done for greed, for the economy. And do you still think greed was good, like Gordon Gekko said? Well, I got to tell you, as a Christian, I know that Jesus had a big problem with greed. In fact, Jesus never talked about sex, but he talked about greed all the way through all 4 Gospels. And he had a real problem with rich people. When the rich boy came and said, I want to follow you, and Jesus said, all right, give away your money and come follow me. And the rich boy walked away because he wasn't going to do that. And Jesus knew that you can't serve 2 masters. You can't serve wealth and greed and be loving, because greed is the opposite of love. Greed is always selfish, and love always cares. It's not an emotion, it's a point of view, love. And greed is what fascism is all about. It's not about the greater good. It's just about feathering your own nest. And so Jesus was not a big fan of greed. I am not a big fan of greed. And I know that it is the root of so much evil in this world. Now, this I read, and it was in today's opinion section. I don't usually do any articles from the opinion section of the Wall Street Journal. But this was an article in the opinion section, and he told the Wall Street Journal last week, Trump said, quote, and a globalist. And when I first read that at the beginning of the article, I was like, ugh, you know, how can you be both? But then I realized after thinking about it, I kind of am too. Now, I'm for fair trade, not this free trade that we have now with the likes of people like Gilbert Odima of Uganda. But the guy that wrote the article, his name is Walter Russell Mead. And if you can find it, I definitely think you should read it because it's the most intelligent thing written about the Trump presidency yet. And he's a professor of foreign affairs at Bard College, which, as far as I know, is a very liberal school. I've visited the campus. A friend of mine went there. It's on the Hudson River, and it's an absolutely beautiful place, and I think it's very liberal. But he said, Walter Russell Mead, professor at Bard College, has said this, quote, "A cosmopolitan and technocratic political class that neither speaks the language nor feels the pull of nationalist solidarity cannot successfully lead a democratic society." And that's why they, both elite parties, lost the election. He also goes on to say, "An unpatriotic and anti-nationalist elite produces people who feather their own nest without regard to the common good." And that is why they lost the election. They had Hillary Clinton and the establishment Republicans had no regard for the middle class, and that is the common good. He also goes on to say, "American power built the present world order, and it must lead it." But this is the key, this is the kicker. He said, "A divided society with an eviscerated middle class cannot provide the stable, coherent leadership that is required to keep this world order together." And he's absolutely right. And the bottom line of that, basically, the short way of putting that is that Peoria matters much more than Davos. And it does. You know, this nation was great because it had a rich middle class. We had a great market because our middle class could go shopping. They could buy French wine. Not anymore, because they're gone. The middle class has been replaced by the working poor. They are the largest segment of workers now in this country. And the working poor have 3 jobs per household. But I say further, to add to Mr. Mead's commentary, the post-World War II trading order helped create the middle class because it favored trading partners that respected human rights, civil rights, and labor rights. So what I mean is that before Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan came along, we did give most favored nation trading status to Europe or Scandinavia, people that respected human rights and civil rights, but no more. Now we have Milton Friedman's globalist New World Order, as Bush the father called it, and it favors reprehensible trading partners and has destroyed the American and Western nations' middle class. But not just the middle class, our freedoms too. Since the New World Friedman and Ronald Reagan brought us, we now have total surveillance. We're surveilled more than any Nazi surveilled. We are surveilled more than any. We have torture. And we didn't just torture a few people. We tortured tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. And we did it in giant warehouses. And we did it globally on an industrial scale. And of course, we now have a police state. We have the highest incarceration rates on earth. The highest percentage of our citizens are in jail, higher than any other country. And that's the acid test of freedom, and we fail it roundly. We jail more people than China does, and China doesn't have any human rights, any civil rights, any labor rights. And we jail our people, and most of our jailing is, I think, racist, and it's also hysterical, pot smokers and people who use illegal drugs. But we're not just losing the middle class, we're losing our very freedom, and we're losing, in my opinion, our souls. Now, Dr. Mead says, the U.S. must be simultaneously a nationalist power focused on the prosperity and security of its own people and a globalist power working to secure the foundations of international order. But I would add, not this international order. We've got to quit favoring nations like China who don't have human rights. We have to quit favoring nations like Uganda, who are just depraved. But we're just depraved too. You know, kids disappear in this country all the time. And I'd like to say that, you know, as far as ritualistic killings, I heard on NPR, National Propaganda Radio, and this is typical of that. Actually, it was on BBC early in the morning. They said, this was a couple of years ago, that 20 torsos of approximately 11 to 12-year-old boys were found floating in the Thames River with no limbs. And I never heard about it again. Now, you would think that 20 children's torsos floating in the Thames River, you know, would get a little investigative reporting, would have a little follow-up, but none. Just like the giant pedophilia scandal with 200 high-profile people implicated has not been reported. Maybe it's reported in England, but not here. It does not interest our greedy elites who, you know, remember the movie Eyes Wide Shut? And that big fancy house on a log island where they were having a ritual sex? And that movie was very cryptic and very weird. It had Tom Cruise in it. It got very little publicity. It had a very short life in the theaters, and it was gone. And I've never heard a movie critic ever discuss it since. And I do believe that there are people who believe they have esoteric knowledge that if they rape children and murder them, and this little girl in Uganda was probably raped too. All these things, you know, if you are greedy, if you are all about money, then you are serving Satan. You are one of Satan's people. And these people in Uganda were trying to please demons. They called them dark spirits. But those are demons. And I'm a Christian, and I believe in Satan. And he is real. And the Bible says, the New Testament says that Satan rules this world. Every country, including ours. And these things are happening in every country. England, America, Uganda, no difference. This is how evil this new world order is. And it is evil. So I would add that we have to secure the foundations of international order that is decent. But I don't think our leaders are decent. And I don't want to say they're evil. And I know I just said that, and I'm sorry. Because judgment is when you condemn somebody. And I don't want to condemn anybody to be evil. And I don't know who's doing these things. But they are happening everywhere. And we are all about greed. You don't hear our leaders talking about freedom or human rights because it's embarrassing. We can't. How can we talk about human rights? We're a nation of torturers. I'm a torturer because this is a government supposedly of the people, by the people, and for the people. But we all know it's really of and for and by the corporations, as Nader always said. But Nader refused to call it fascism because he's a Harvard lawyer, and they're professional liars. They really are. So Mr. Mead goes on to say, Mr. Trump appears to understand this truth better than his many vituperative critics. And it is true. You have to be a globalist too, because trade is a good thing, but this free trade is a very evil, evil thing. And it is making really evil regimes very powerful. And they have no incentive to clean up their acts because they've got most favored nations trading status. So I hope he can renegotiate these trade bills. I hope he won't give up on that. Now it's time for the last segment, the Luddite Lounge. And there is a new movie. I'm going to go see it at some point. I don't think it's here in Louisville yet, and it's called The Circle, and you may have heard about it. The tech writer for the Wall Street Journal did a story about it. It's based on the 2013 David Eggers novel of the same name. A seemingly innocent company called Circle invented something called True You, which is a digital passport, and a social network. That's how they originally started. But as the movie goes on, they invent something, and their motto, by the way, is called Sharing and Caring, is the company's slogan. Then, later on, the company invents these tiny, always streaming cameras that are everywhere. And they say it's to improve safety and document abuse. Sounds good, right? And another slogan they have, this is all fictional, of course, you know, Tom Hanks is the head of this company called Circle. Another slogan is knowing is good, knowing everything is better. It's directed, and the screenplay was written by a guy named James Ponsoldt, P-O-N-S-O-L-D-T. And this is a guy who loves tech and describes himself as an early adapter. But he said that he was actually interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, and he told the Wall Street Journal reporter that privacy is fundamental to humanity. And if you're being watched, you're not really free. He also said that, and I'm paraphrasing, if you talk about this or make a movie about it, you'll be called paranoid by society. And of course, I know this because I've been told I'm paranoid. Oh, this data collecting, our government's not evil. Well, actually, it is evil. Torture is evil. It's the most evil thing you can do. Ask any psychiatrist. Torture makes murder merciful. Torture can go on indefinitely, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. And there were army doctors of the U.S. Army that brought these people back to health so they could be tortured again. And a lot of the evidence we had about Abu Ghraib came from army doctors' files. I don't want to get back on to torture, but let's talk about this movie. So I do know that if you talk about the surveillance state, you will be called paranoid. The director, Ponsoldt, also says he's shocked more people don't talk about it. Well, he shouldn't be shocked. He knows why, because nobody wants to be called paranoid or backwards or a dinosaur. I've been called all those things and worse. I prefer to be called a free thinker. But who wants to be ridiculed by the proletariat or our hateful elitist press? And funny as it was, on the same page is this article on the movie, is an article about Amazon's Echo Look, which guess what? Echo is that artificial intelligence, it's like a personal assistant, and it's always on, and it's always had speakers and microphones, but now it has a camera, hence the Echo Look. It costs $200. And if you ask me what it is, it's an artificial intelligence home spying system. Because anything that happens in your home is going to be recorded by Jeff Bezos of Amazon, the very manipulative, very greedy guy, and who does not treat his employees well. And when the story came out about what hellish places his warehouses were to work, there was no follow-up. And everybody said, oh, we're sorry. Because he's got power. He can advertise. Oh, you want to see our ads in the Wall Street Journal? Well, don't run that story. And the corporate press dutifully, being propaganda ministers, all of them, comply. Anyway, the often unspoken, really imperative of all these tech companies is collecting data. They have a voracious appetite for data because they monetize it. They sell it. They use it to manipulate you. And Amazon does. They use behavioral science to manipulate people, and they charge you different prices, as we reported last week, based on your psychological profile, which they have on every individual. Anyway, there's an innocent-sounding purpose for Echo, just like the innocent-sounding purpose of this the little tiny cameras in the movie The Circle. And they say what it is to, quote, enable consumers to take videos and photos of outfits and compare them via algorithm. Basically, a virtual home fitting room. That's all it is, to help Amazon sell clothes. Sounds real innocent, doesn't it? Well, that's our show today. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back next week. That is, if I'm still kicking. Remember, be free, live up, and I love you. See you next time. Let's dance.